Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're digging into a really fascinating question that came up from Kesser, a student.
What was that?
He was thinking about something pretty basic or seemingly basic. How exactly do plants pull minerals out of the soil?
Right. It's not always obvious.
Especially, when those minerals aren't easily dissolved, like how do they grab stuff that's almost solid? And what about their preferences?
That's a great starting point Kesser had, because it really forces you to think beyond roots just kind of passively soaking things up.
Exactly. It's much more active, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. Very cleverly engineered, as we'll get into.
And his questions didn't stop there. He also noticed how different minerals behave inside the plant. Potassium, for instance, seems to, zip around.
Very mobile.
But then calcium, much more stationary.
Right. Stays put more.
So our focus today is really this conversation Kesser had with Professor Hendricks. They went deep into these details, especially, and this is interesting, around silica.
Silica. Yeah, that's a good one. And it's cool how Kesser's line of thinking pulls in chemistry, evolution.
Even dinosaur plants, apparently.
Huh. Yeah, it connects to some surprisingly old plant strategies.
Okay, so let's jump in where Kesser and Professor Hendricks started. Silica. Kesser was apparently a bit fuzzy on the difference between silica and silicium.
Common point of confusion. So silicon, silica, that's the element on the periodic table.
Right.
But plants aren't really grabbing elemental silicon. They're interacting with silica, which is silicon dioxide, SiO, or related forms.
Okay, SiO, but how does that get in? Isn't it like sand?
Well, yes and no. The key is that some of it dissolves in the soil water to form something called monomeric silicic acid, HSCO.
Monomeric silicic acid.
Okay, and here's the kicker, the point Kesser really keyed in on. This molecule, HSCO, it's neutral, no electrical charge.
Ah, right. Unlike, say, potassium ions, Ca or calcium, Cal, those are charged.
Exactly. Which leads to the next puzzle.
How does a neutral molecule get into the root cell? They don't have the usual ion channels pulling it in.
Precisely. Turns out, plants use these aquaporin-like channels.
Aquaporins. Aren't those mainly for water?
Primarily, yes.
Yeah.
And other small neutral molecules. So silicic acid can kind of slip through these same channels. It's quite efficient, really.
Wow. So it piggybacks on the water transport system, basically.
In a way, yeah. It's a very different mechanism than grabbing those charged ions, which need specific protein gates.
Okay, so it gets inside as silicic acid. Does it stay like that?
No. And that's the next interesting step. Inside the plant, Professor Hendricks explained, it undergoes polymerization, or condensation, you could call it. Meaning the individual silicic acid molecules link up, release water, and form, essentially, solid silicon deposits. It sees you grow in Asia, like tiny bits of opal, almost.
And where do these deposits form?
Mostly in the cell walls. It helps make them rigid. Think of horsetails agar-padrock you mentioned.
Yeah, they're quite stiff, almost scratchy.
That's the silica. Those deposits provide structural support and also act as a physical defense against pests and diseases.
Huh. So Kesser's question about the difference in uptake, ions versus silicic acid, it really highlights a fundamental split in how plants get and use elements.
It really does. Very sharp question.
And that flows right into his other observation, mineral mobility. Some move, some don't.
Yep. He noticed that variation. Potassium, cough, is the classic example of high mobility.
Zips around, as I said.
Yeah. Zips around, goes wherever it's needed, controlling water balance, activating enzymes, all sorts of critical stuff.
But calcium cough.
Much, much less mobile. Once it's incorporated into, say, a cell wall in an older leaf, it tends to stay there.
Which explains why deficiency shows up in new growth first. The plant can't easily move the old calcium to the new leaves.
Exactly that. The supply has to come up from the roots constantly for new tissues.
Okay, that makes sense. And it also clinks with what Professor Hendricks said about foliar sprays for calcium.
Right, spraying the leaves.
It gets calcium into those leaves directly, but doesn't mean it then travels everywhere else in the plant.
Precisely. It's a localized fix because internal transport of calcium is so limited. It bypasses the root uptake and the internal distribution limits.
What about other nutrients, like phosphorus?
Phosphorus, usually taken up as phosphate, PO, is generally considered mobile. It can be redistributed.
Okay.
And Professor Hendricks raised a really interesting possibility there, too.
Which was?
That if another nutrient is kind of chemically stuck to phosphate, forming a complex molecule, the plant might recognize that complex and transport it, essentially giving the other nutrient a ride along with the mobile phosphate.
Wow, so the plant recognizes molecular partnerships. That's sophisticated.
It suggests a level of chemical recognition and transport beyond just simple ions. Yeah. It's not just about charge, it's the whole package.
So mobility depends on charge, the specific chemical form, the plant's transport systems. It's complicated.
Very. Which explains the different patterns we see and why strategies like foliar feeding work better for some nutrients than others.
Right. Now let's switch gears a bit. Kesser apparently also got talking with a toxicologist about aluminum.
Ow. Aluminum. Abundant in the crust, but usually bad news for plants.
Yeah, that was a puzzle. Why is it generally harmful? Professor Hendricks shed some light.
The main issue is in acidic soils. Low pH.
Okay, what happens then?
The aluminum dissolves and forms the allo ion, a triple positive charge.
And that's the problem.
That's the problem. That charged ion interferes with the root's ability to take up essential nutrients like calcium and magnesium. It can also directly damage the root cells themselves.
Nasty stuff. But the hortensia, hydrangeas, their blue color comes from aluminum, doesn't it?
Ah, the classic example. Yes, but it's not because the plant needs aluminum nutritionally.
It doesn't, so what's happening?
It's a chemical reaction. In acidic soils, the available aluminum ions get taken up and interact with the pigments already in the flower petals, anthocyanins.
And that interaction changes the color.
Exactly. The aluminum binding to the pigment shifts its color towards blue. In soils with less available aluminum, less acidic soils, those same pigments stay pink or red.
So it's like a chemical side effect with a pretty result, not nutrition.
You got it. Purely a chemical interaction dictated by soil pH and aluminum availability.
Fascinating. Kesser then apparently made a connection linking solubility, like how easily something dissolves.
Yeah.
Like comparing potassium nitrate, KNOS, which dissolves easily, with calcium carbonate, CoQ, which doesn't.
Right. Big difference in solubility.
Linking that to how available and mobile nutrients are.
That's a really sharp insight from Kesser. It's fundamental.
Yeah.
And Professor Hendricks built on that, mentioning an older idea about plant evolution.
Oh, like how early plants got nutrients.
Yeah, the theory that plants evolving from algae just absorb nutrients directly from the water, all over their surface. No complex roots yet.
Huh. So the ability to absorb nutrients through leaves' foliar uptake might actually be a really ancient trait.
That's the idea. A leftover capability from that early stage of evolution before specialized roots became the main thing for land plants.
So maybe foliar spraying is just tapping into that old system.
Could be. And Professor Hendricks brought up dinosaur plants.
The horsetails again. And ferns.
Exactly. Things like horsetails and ferns, older lineages, they might still rely more on some of these ancient mechanisms. It suggests nutrient uptake isn't all, modern and streamlined across the board.
Different plants, different strategies, some older than others.
Precisely. And Kesser's point about foliar spraying, perhaps leveraging those older direct absorption routes, makes a lot of sense in that context.
These evolutionary echoes are really cool. Okay, then Steen, Kesser collaborator, brought up another important point.
What was that?
The misconception that plants get most of their building blocks from the soil, that they're basically eating soil.
Ah, yes. Professor Hendricks probably jumped on that one. It's a huge misunderstanding.
So where do they get most of their mass?
From the air. The vast majority of a plant's dry weight is carbon, and that carbon comes from atmospheric SiCO pulled in during photosynthesis.
Right, photosynthesis, co-shoe from the air.
And nitrogen, another crucial element, ultimately originates from the air too, even if it's absorbed from the soil. It has to be fixed by bacteria or supplied as fertilizer derived from atmospheric nitrogen. The soil mainly provides the minerals and water.
It really changes how you picture a plant growing, doesn't it? It's mostly built from air and water with minerals mixed in.
Absolutely. It connects to ideas like no-dig gardening, to focusing on the soil life that makes minerals available, rather than just seeing soil as stuff the plant eats.
And Professor Hendricks mentioned plants aren't passive anyway. They can actively get minerals out of rocks.
That's right. Roots release substances, organic acids like oxalic acid, citric acid, enzymes too.
And these dissolve the minerals.
They help break down mineral structures, yes. They can solubilize phosphorus or iron or other things that are locked up and unavailable otherwise. Plants are active miners in their own right.
Active miners. I like that. Then there was one more weird thing. Hyperaccumulators.
Oh, yeah, those are wild. Plants that soak up incredibly high levels of heavy metals.
Like zinc, nickel, cadmium, stuff that's usually toxic.
Exactly. They don't necessarily use these metals, but they've evolved ways to absorb huge amounts and tolerate them.
How?
Usually by storing them safely away, often in the vacuoles within their cells, or binding them to special proteins so they can't cause damage. It's often an adaptation to growing in soils naturally high in those metals.
Incredible adaptations. Okay, so wrapping this all up, Kesser's curiosity really opened a can of worms, didn't it? In a good way.
Absolutely. From a simple question about mineral uptake to all these different strategies.
Yeah, we've seen it's not just simple ion absorption. Silica using aquaporins, totally different.
A neutral molecule pathway.
Mineral mobility varying wildly, potassium zipping, calcium staying put.
Big differences based on chemistry and transport.
Even bad elements like aluminum having weird interactions, like the hortensia color trick.
A chemical side effect, not nutrition.
And the evolutionary angle, the idea of ancient pathways in plants not just eating soil, but actively mining it and building themselves from air.
It paints a much richer, more dynamic picture of how plants live and interact with their environment. Kesser and Steen really hit on some key points.
It shows how these basic biological functions mix chemistry, physics, evolution, just fascinating stuff.
It really is.
So, a final thought for you listening. How could really getting these details about nutrient uptake sparked by Kesser asking how change things? Maybe how we approach agriculture, or how we see plant evolution, or even just our view of life pulling what it needs from rock and air.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it?
What other simple-seeming questions in biology are hiding that kind of complexity, just waiting for someone to dig a little deeper? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.